Great. So our guest speaker today is Dasse, who has been involved in several startups and companies within the cardiovascular space. Currently, he is the president and CEO of Inspire Therapeutics LLC and clinical professor of cardiothoracic surgery and bioengineering in the University of Louisville Medical School. If I forgot anything, just edit yourself, Kurt, please. I hope I introduced you correctly. And yeah, we're excited to hear you talking about commercialization today. Yeah, I would say the stage is yours. And start talking, telling us something.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Nina, for a very nice introduction. And I think it covered everything nicely. I'd just like to begin by, first of all, congratulating everybody that's on this call that's participating in the Heart Hackathon project. I'm really impressed with what you were all trying to do with your teams, and I want to wish you the best of luck in succeeding in your goals. So congratulations again. Sounds like a great program. As Nina mentioned, the topic I'm going to talk about is how to create a successful medical business. And as you can imagine, there's no one way of doing anything. And that's especially true of how to create a successful business. So what I thought I'd do is narrow the scope down a little bit and really talk about my journey to build a successful business. And I thought it might be helpful if I gave a little bit of my background as to how I prepared myself to get ready to launch a new business on my own. So if we go to the beginning, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, I was 20 years old and in the military, and I was sent to Vietnam as a medic. And it was both a traumatic but also enriching experience. And I show this slide mainly because I remember this very day when this young Vietnamese man was brought to our facility. He'd been stabbed in the back. And I took him to the operating room and I patched him up. But as I was patching him up, I remember that day saying, you know, I really want to pursue a career in medicine somehow, some way. So 10 years later, I received my doctorate in medical physiology from Boston University School of Medicine, and stayed in academia for many years, starting as an assistant professor in physiology at Boston University. But I was also concurrently an instructor in surgery at Tufts School of Medicine, and also assistant professor of medicine at the veterinary school, and invited lecturer at MIT. So I really enjoyed academia. Along that journey, I was recruited to Tufts Medical Center to head up surgical research. And I was assigned a task of focusing on a new technology called a left ventricular assist device, which no one had ever heard of in those days. But as I was doing my research, I came to the realization that, you know, this just might work. This could save lives. And I decided I really wanted to focus my career in this whole mechanical circulatory support space. I was fortunate that a number of years later, I was invited to be a co-founder of a company called Thermocardia Systems, where I served as senior vice president. I mainly oversaw clinical affairs, which was, you know, being a liaison between R&D and the clinical sites, designing and running clinical trials, but also learning about the operations of, you know, regulatory, quality, manufacturing, and the like. During that tenure, we developed on the left the HeartMate implantable pneumatic device, which was the first device to receive regulatory approval in the world for end-stage heart failure patients. We realized there was a large pneumatic console driving this positive displacement pump. So we went on to incorporate a low-speed torque motor into the rear chamber of the pump and created what was called the HeartMate XVE, or Bennett electric device. But these two devices had three failure modes, one of which was they had valves, they had a flexing diaphragm, they also had mechanical bearings. So we decided we wanted to eliminate some of those failure modes and went on to acquire Nimbus and refined what became HeartMate 2. HeartMate 2 eliminated the valves and eliminated the flexing diaphragm, but we are still left with mechanical bearings. So further room for improvement going forward in the future. After that, I got invited to be the chief science officer of what was called Thermo Electron Corporation, which is now Thermo Fisher Scientific. And the biomedical group oversaw 20 medical companies. And I served a role of overseeing or troubleshooting R&D for each of those companies, but also was on the mergers and acquisition team, serving as the expert to decide what acquisitions of companies we wanted to make. So I learned a lot about finance. The whole point of this whole discussion is that I had 15 years in industry, both small companies, startups, and large companies before considering starting a company on my own. Oops. So at this point, I said, well, maybe it's time to start thinking about creating a medical company. I'm just going to move the, there we go. So in thinking about starting a medical company, I thought, the first thing I had to do was establish a vision. And I kind of defined the vision as identifying a gap in the marketplace for medical devices and something that would be met an unmet need for the treatment of patients that was uniquely different. And then to build on that vision, to want to have a pipeline of different projects or products to build a conglomerate, which should be able to rival the likes of Medtronic, Boston Scientific, J&J, and Abbott. So yes, I had a grandiose vision, but the investors really liked it. But that's different from a tactical plan, where the tactical plan is your business plan or how you're going to execute your business. So young CEOs, when asked about a vision, oftentimes start citing their business plan, which is not a vision. So keep in mind, there's a difference between a vision and a tactical plan in the minds of investors. So I went on to found Levitronics in 2001. My vision for the company was to build a company with a pipeline of superior mechanical circulatory support products. And I did identify a gap in the market where there were devices that were approved for 6 hours, such as the Medtronic biopump for cardiopulmonary bypass. But at the other end of the spectrum, we had devices that were durable, implantable devices like thermal cardio systems had developed. But there was no highly reliable 30-day device that could serve as what I called a bridge decision. In other words, oftentimes when you have these end-stage heart patients, you don't know their neurologic status. And so it's attractive to try to stabilize them hemodynamically while you decide whether they're ultimately going to recover or if they're going to go on to transplantation, or do they need a long-term durable device? So that was the gap I identified, and that's how we started. So now I've got the vision, and I've got a plan, and it's time to gather the intellectual property for the company. And so I had seen that a company called Sulzer in Switzerland had an industrial group that was working on unique technology that actually came out of the ETH Technical Institute of Switzerland. And that technology was magnetic levitation. In other words, rather than have mechanical bearings, you could levitate the spinning component, the impeller within a device, and eliminate the failure modes that we were concerned with, which included the valves, shafts, seals, mechanical bearings, and the flexing diaphragms. So we got the intellectual property, and then it was time to create a commercialization plan. And this is too busy, and I know you can't really see the details, but the plan breaks out all the tasks for R&D, regulatory, quality, clinical, manufacturing, sales and marketing, and management as a function of 4 phases of design control over time. And there's literally 500 line items of tasks that needed to be considered. And it was not only for R&D, but for every department in the in this business that we were contemplating. So we have an extensive detailed plan. And then the next steps was to see what the major milestones and timelines would be that the shareholders and investors would be most interested in. So looking at the preclinical line item, the first goal was to get the design freeze so we could do the verification studies and GLP animal studies, et cetera. And then from a regulatory perspective and clinical or quality, submitting an investigational device exemption in the United States for a submission for regulatory anywhere to start a clinical trial, to then get the approval, and then to begin the clinical trial, and then eventually aim for regulatory approval. So now we have our major milestones and timelines set. I know that the teams have been working on developing business plans, which is an essential document. And this slide illustrates the table of contents, if you will, of the business plan that I drafted, which I think is very similar to what you've been doing. I also needed other investor documents. I needed a 2-page executive summary that could capture the vision and the essence of the business plan to hook and excite investors. Needed to create a pitch deck, a slide deck that would, again, immediately get the interest of investors, which also included a financial forecast, so they could go right to that and say they're interested or not. So we've got these documents in place, and then we had to figure out what kind of investment would we want. So often a mistake early companies make is to put a valuation on a company in its early stage, which is going to be a low valuation and basically giving the store away. An alternative is to create what's called a convertible note. And the convertible note is basically a loan with a term and an interest rate. But at the end of a convertible note, the investor can either ask to be paid, or more often than not, if you're successful, they want to convert to equity at fair market value at a discount. And so now we know we want to raise money in the form of a convertible note. The next task is to assemble a board of directors, which oftentimes at this early stage are the investors. So board of directors, well, I focused on high net worth individuals. And for example, George Atsopoulos was the founder of what is Thermo Fisher. At the time, he was doing $4 billion in revenues. Alex Darbeloff was the chairman of MIT. He also created a company called Teradyne, which was doing $16 billion in revenues per year. And last but not least, Roger Sant was the chairman of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. He was an original board member of Marriott Hotels. He created a company called AES, a utility company that was doing $25 billion a year. So I had a fantastic board, all of which that were qualified investors that could invest in the company and make it successful. So now we got the board of directors, it's time to get a management team. So I was the CEO overall of the company, but set up a US operation with the positions that you can see here. And half the company was also set up in Switzerland, in Zurich, with its organization. But we adopted a core philosophy from the very beginning. And that is, to be a successful medical device business, the journey is all about the patient. And if the patient benefits, clinicians will want it. If the clinicians want it, the hospitals will buy it. And it's extremely critical to really provide the best service possible. And these are the core philosophies we live by. So I've been saying a lot of I's from here. And I think that's a mistake that CEOs make, because you're only as good as the team that you put together. So at this point, we shift to what we did. And so the first thing I wanted to do is create an equity incentive plan with 2 objectives. The first was to incentivize the recipients to build company value by letting the recipients benefit from the company's growth and value, and then to align the interests of the recipients, i.e. the employees, with goals of the company. And what this does is it gives every employee ownership in the company and pride and motivation to make it succeed. Now we have to form a structure for this company. And in the United States, the structure could be a C Corp or an S Corp, or it could be a limited liability company. In Europe, it could be a GmbH or an AG. What we decided to do is form a limited liability company, mainly for tax purposes. We headquartered the company in Boston, and as I mentioned, half of it was in Switzerland. And the Swiss facility is basically considered tax-wise the disregarded entity or a branch. So it was wholly owned, but it was a separate company. Okay, so we got these things in order. Now, we realized that these maglev pumps could be used for a variety of purposes. So we focused on the medical pumps, as you can see listed, but we also had industrial pumps, and that was a really excellent market. And early revenues from industrial pumps could offset the cost of getting regulatory approvals on the medical pumps. So just to recap where we are, we formed this limited liability company. We've got the intellectual property wrapped up. We've got the important investor documents made available. We have a board of directors, we have a management team, and we've decided to have two divisions, a medical and an industrial division. Now it's time to set the goals for the company. And what we wanted to do is identify a platform of products capable of generating multiple products. And we wanted short-term products, both in the medical and industrial divisions. We wanted the company to create revenues within 2 to 3 years, and then use those revenues to offset the cost of the longer-term product. And then, very importantly, aim for profitability as soon as possible. We have our goals. And, the next thing that's really underappreciated by early stage companies is you have to create a quality system. And to get regulatory approvals to say start a clinical trial, you have to have both design and document controls in place. So the pyramid shown to the right illustrates what a quality system is set up. So you start with a quality manual at the top, and it really describes all your policies and your quality system requirements. And it calls out standard operating procedures, of which you're going to see about 19 of them that have to be drafted and followed. Supporting that are general procedures that define very specific components of the system. And then beneath that, the manufacturing procedures, and then forms. So that's the structure of a quality system. And the problem is a lot of early stage companies have the problem of build it first and document later. That's a disaster, because the FDA goes back to day one of the company and reviews what you're doing on your quality system. I mentioned that under the quality manual are the standard operating procedures. This lists what the standard operating procedures for a medical device company have to be. Each one of these has to be drafted, but more importantly, when they're released into the quality system, you have to follow each of these. And if you don't follow them, what the regulatory bodies audit you, you'll be cited for it. And if you get 3 or 4 citations, you're going to get a warning letter from regulatory bodies. So these are the standard operating procedures that we drafted. And at this point, it was really time to add more positions. Needed to have a chief financial officer. A lot of legal documents begin accumulating, so I need a general counsel, adding human resources, clinical specialists, more engineers. We're growing. So now we have all the resources we need to really begin product development. And so the first step in product development is to get yourself under design control and begin with a conceptual design for your product. In this case, we were designing what was called the central magnet trigger assist system. And along the way, at this point, we filed additional intellectual property We had to get proper insurance in place, both general liability and medical liability insurance. We had to add software and manufacturing engineers at this point. Along the way, we also took on the project to co-develop HeartMate 3 for what was then Thoracic, that became St. Jude, that is now Abbott. And so we developed the magnetic levitation system for HeartMate 3, in addition to our own products. We had regulatory requirements that we had to start meeting. We had to have a written regulatory strategy. We needed to, under design control, implement risk management and have a document in support of that, start performing all the risk analyses, hazard analysis, FMEAs. We had to create a verification validation plan for how we're going to go about testing this device. We had to start thinking about drafting clinical trial documents, and all of this has to be done under good laboratory practices, good clinical practices, and good manufacturing practice. I mentioned design controls, and I showed you the whole commercialization plan was based on design controls and the 4 phases and time. One of the most important early documents that has to be drafted in phase 1 design control are the user needs. And obviously other documents of the product requirement spec, the design input requirements, risk analysis, human factors, and so on. But I want to draw your attention to this diagram to the right, which comes from the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. So you start with user needs. Now, user needs are when you go to the field and you document what the user wants this device to do. And then based on your user requirements, you begin creating your product, your design input requirements, which is basically your specifications. You define your process. And then design output is when you have followed your test protocols and you're confirming through your testing that you meet your design input requirements. And then you got yourself a medical device. So that's the verification phase. That's all the preclinical testing phase. But then you move to validation. What does validation mean? Validation comes in like 3 forms for a medical device. Most importantly is your clinical trial, but you also have GLP animal studies and software validation. So validation is showing in a clinical trial that you met your user needs. So you can see how critical user needs are. If you don't meet your user needs, you're not validating your product. So important to do all this under design control. You also have to set up an elaborate document control system. Every document has to be numbered, revved. It has to be filed in a very organized way. And when regulatory bodies come in to inspect you, you have to have it so organized that you can just literally pull them up at any moment while sitting in a conference room to review for an audit. I mentioned the verification validation plan. This shows what I use for verifying and validating a pediatric VAD. These are all the procedures that need to be drafted, which are all tests that need to be completed to show that your device is safe and ready for carrying out a clinical trial. Among those tests were animal studies. And I just want to emphasize what regulatory bodies don't want to see that you've done 42 animals and these are our results. They want to see a roadmap. And what they mean by a roadmap is that, for example, you break it out in cohorts of studies. So you start with, I did 3 feasibility studies. They're acute animal studies, and this is what I learned. But I did see that there was a problem. So then my second cohort, still non-GLP studies, is that I did solve that problem, but I see another area for improvement, and so on. And those iterative studies lead up to your ultimate GLP animal validation studies. So again, the non-GLP studies are verification. The GLP animal studies are validation. And for a VAD, FDA wants to see basically 6 surviving animals out of 10 with no neurologic dysfunction, And that allows you to complete your verification or validation study. And also, I just emphasize, if you got negative findings like thrombus and infarcts, which everybody has in organs when you do these devices, just report them up front and don't make the agency dig for it. Well, it's time to bring in manufacturing. But we had manufacturing engineers early on because they were a liaison between the R&D group and manufacturing. Oftentimes, it's not manufacturable. So you really want to bridge the gap and have manufacturing engineering. And then you have to scale up manufacturing for all the pumps you're going to need for doing your verification, validation, testing. And you have to train everybody to comply with good manufacturing practices. And then you have to scale up for the clinical trial. And then you further scale up for your commercial launch. So there's a lot of manufacturing that has to be considered. Now, I mentioned, the validation is a clinical trial. And what the regulatory bodies want to see is, first of all, some sort of pre-meeting with the regulatory body to describe through a clinical synopsis, which is like a 2 or 3 page outline of what your clinical trial will be, patient selection criteria, primary and secondary endpoints, and so on. And then based on that meeting, and if they agree with your clinical synopsis, then you go on and develop your full-blown clinical protocols, which are elaborate. Then you're going to need instructions for use in your clinical standard operating procedures, and then you're going to be able to conduct your trial. Well, at this point, ready, products moving along, manufacturing set up, time to hire sales and marketing. So I had in the United States I had hired a national sales manager, and I had 3 regional sales manager. And then internationally, I had a sales manager that aligned up 26 distributors worldwide to sell our product. And then we really need strong technical support.
Video's off and I'm muted.
And the goal at this point is to, now we got sales and revenues coming in, to grow the company to profitability. And so we had about 35 million in revenues after about 5 years, which is pretty good. We had an additional 15 millions of government grants, so 50 million total. And we're now operating at a profit margin of about 70%. So once you're profitable, you own the world. And when you are profitable, it's not surprising that you have a couple of different exit strategies. You could either go with a public offering, or you might have a strategic that wants to acquire you. Either way, you have to have due diligence files created. And this kind of shows the various folders that you want to create for your due diligence documents. You need your company structure, you need your patents in another one, you need your financial statements. You want to have an area where you have your product development plan and all of these other items. So it came to a point where we did have an exit option. We had paid off our convertible note. We just paid it off so that we didn't owe anybody anything. And therefore, Levitronics regained all the rights back to directly market our devices, as opposed to having Thoracic market them. However, Thoracic liked the device so much, and they were at risk of not being able to sell it anymore. They responded by making an offer to acquire the medical division of Levitronics. So we carved out the medical division, and we sold it to Thoracic in 2011 for $150 million. So Thoracic got the CentraMag system and they got the PDMag system, but unfortunately, we had developed 2 other systems. On the upper right, you see this titanium pump. That was called the UltraMag, and I can talk about that during the Q&A. And on the lower left, we developed an integrated pump oxygenator that had all the hollow fiber technology. The pump was integrated, the heat exchanger was integrated, for a very elegant, simple solution to reduce the complexity of ECMO to a single module. But Thoracic did not market those 2 devices. They both got shelved, and we can talk about that later. So I'm just going to start wrapping up by saying, what I perceive as the characteristics of the most successful entrepreneurs that I've seen create medical companies. They're more often than not engineers, clinicians, and scientists, i.e., all of you on the call. I mean, any one of you could create a business. Rarely attended business school, just had an aptitude for business. And a lot of it was on the job training. They were able to apply their technical skills and expertise to product development. They all have people skills and good judgment if they're going to be successful. So was Levitronic successful, sustainable business? Well, Levitronic still exists and celebrating 21 years as a business. So it was a success. And just to finish off, I wasn't done with that. I've done 3 companies now. This one's my 4th. I've started a new company called Inspired Therapeutics. And in September of last year, I was awarded a $6 million government grant to develop what I call the next generation expiratory system. And you can see this little module in the middle over there. We've taken the whole centromag system, the lower blue hockey puck looking, that's the entire controller. The motor is above it, stands about 4 inches high and 3 inches wide, very small. So it's the next generation system. So I just want to conclude by, saying, yep, create a vision and a tactical plan. Choose your board and management team very carefully. Select highly qualified investors. And the investment community often talks about avoiding the 3 F's: friends, family, and fools. Because you have wealthy people that want to invest, but they don't have any idea of the risks of medical devices. And it often causes headaches if you bring those people in as investors. You want to develop disruptive technology, and that often means avoid the bells and whistles that the market demands. Don't listen to them. Keep it simple and use good judgment and maintain credibility. So on that note, I'm going to stop and thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you, and welcome any questions at this point.
Thank you, Kurt. That was a great talk, really interesting. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions. I know we've allocated quite a while to have a discussion about commercialization, which is a really nice way, I think, to go through this workshop. So
great, look forward to it.
So throughout your talk, there have been a few questions submitted online. And I'm just going to go through these. And if anyone else here has some questions, just put up your hands and we're going to throw them in. So I'm going to start with the first one. Someone asked, what was your biggest learning moment throughout your journey?
I think, believe it or not, the realization of the importance of quality system, and not knowing that, let's say you get a product that's took 5 years to get to commercial market. For many regulatory bodies, it requires a pre-approval inspection by the regulatory body. And they come in and they look to see, when did you begin your human factors plan? So you have to pull a document up that shows that you did it 4 years earlier. And they say, pull it up, show me you complied with your plan. And then the next thing will be a day and a half on design control. Show me that you had a product requirement spec. Show me that you complied with your verification validator. So point is, they go all the way back. So every date you put on a document, they look at to see if you did things right. So quality system was a big consideration in the importance of it. Obviously, you have device problems in the field and learning how to deal. So every single product we developed, the HeartMate IP, the XVE, the HeartMate 2, the very first series of patients, we always had a device problem, and we actually had patient death. And it's a very traumatic experience when you know that your device has a flaw and you can't take them out of patient, but you think risk benefit. We've saved 70% of the patients, going along the way, but now we discover a problem. Do we recall it? How do you manage that situation? So that's a little bit very challenging to maintain safety for patients and solve problems.
Yeah, I guess especially in this field, like a little mistake has like a huge impact.
And you always have them, and you have to be prepared for crisis management because, you know, when you have a death in the field, you got a board of directors, you got investors, you got employees, everybody's coming at you in 10 different directions. Like, what are you going to do about this? Right? The answer is fix it.
Very true. I'll move on to the next question. Someone asked, how do you know you need to hire more people? And how do you estimate how many?
Yeah, I mean, headcount's really important. Actually, in the commercialization plan, which I showed you, which was way too detailed for you to really see, for each step along the way, there was a separate tab of forecasting the headcount, who we were going to hire at any point in time. So there's a plan, but the plan has to match the level of funding. So, you know, you forecast it, but you are limited at each point in time by how much money you've raised. And so you adjust the headcount to be consistent with the amount of funding that's available.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really important to consider all of these points.
But you plan it out ahead of time because it's like if you had a magic wand and you had all the money in the world, this is what you would do. But then you come back to reality saying, well, I'm supposed to be hiring 10 people right now, but I only have the budget to hire 6. Well, you only hire 6 and try to raise more money.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to really plan every step in detail if you don't know what your fund's gonna be like. I'm gonna move on to the next question. Someone asked you to talk further about how you went about recruiting the initial team and board of directors and how you dealt with the equity split.
Well, that's a mouthful. So let's start with the board of directors. I was fortunate in that my first board of directors was George Dasse, who founded Thermo Fisher Scientific. And George put $10 million in. At the time, we didn't even know what we were going to develop. We had no business plan. And so I went to the other 2 board members I mentioned, and I said, we want to raise money. They said, what's your business plan? I said, we don't have one. But, you know, I was looking at 5 different opportunities at the time, and I saw the amazing technology out of Switzerland. And so there were 3 Ph.D. folks in Switzerland in the electronics marketing group. I offered them jobs, and they worked with us to get the IP. And so they became the founders of the Swiss operation. And we were basically hiring graduate students out of the ETH Technical Institute. So a lot of our staffing was recruited by the Swiss folks in Switzerland from the ETH Institute. And, you know, we had like 28 PhDs in the company, and, you know, a lot of master's students. But in the United States, I hired like head of quality from my former company. And so the first person I hired was quality. And then I hired an R&D out of Boston, R&D VP out of Boston Scientific. And then we hired people we knew. And we knew they were really good. So it was easy to recruit them, and they really loved the project and they really wanted to work with us.
That's an interesting way to approach it, to hire people where you know they're good. That's a good way to avoid surprises, I guess.
Yeah, it really helps. And
Okay,
we put together a really credible and technically smart group. So it was, we really enjoyed the journey.
That's good. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from one of our teams, from the team Maris. What advice you give to us for succeeding on the market? So like to the teams, the participating Hackathon teams, they're all developing their own device, right? So if they want to succeed on the market, what would you like? Which advice would you give the teams?
Well, I think that it's important to develop both that business plan and commercialization plan. But I will say, because I will say I don't know of any company that actually follows the plan. What happens is there's a tangent along the way where you see a new opportunity or a better way of doing things. But if you have the plan and you process new information that comes in and you see a better direction to go, be flexible enough to pursue that better option. And so the plan is important. Judgment, the most important thing about the CEO and the team is exercising good judgment. And you'll see many examples of companies that don't do well because they didn't use good judgment. So flexibility and good judgment are really important to succeed along the way. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm willing to answer it.
I think it sort of does. Otherwise, Alex, do you want to like just jump in and talk yourself if it answered your question, if you're still here? No?
Maybe not. Hey, I see Sebastian Jansen down there. I just want to welcome Sebastian. I'm chairing the Gordon Research Conferences on assisted circulation in the next 3 weeks, and I see that Sebastian's going to come. So looking forward to seeing you, Sebastian.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for your great talk. It was really nice listening to you. I actually do also have a question, if I'm allowed to. I'm not sure. It's a hard hackathon event, so I just sneaked in a little bit.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Nina. Well, my question would be if you have any advice on people still in research institutes, like many ideas progress from projects in the research. And so what can we do already at the level of university to prepare ideas and projects better to later proceed into a startup company? So is there already something that we could address or do or take care of at the university level?
You know, that's where I started. I was, as I mentioned, at Boston University and Tufts. And I was in the same boat. You know, how do I actually move from academia to industry, which is a little bit of a question. So the first question I would ask you is this an individual that is in academia, wants to stay in academia, but wants to create a business as well? Or is this someone that wants to make a move, get trained and educated to move into industry or start their own company? What's the scenario?
Usually like motivated PhD students who want to leave academia and start a startup company at the end of their PhD.
Yeah, I get it, which is exactly what I wanted to do. And so, number one, I think having a Heart Hackathon project is great training for someone in academia that wants to make the move. So this kind of workshop and more workshops like it, where you're talking about creating a product conceptually, you're talking about creating a business plan. You have to learn a little bit about finance to do a financial forecast. So you got to have a little of that and a lot of desire. And then it's a matter of, it's probably not a good idea to go straight from the university and start a company. I would say that it might be more beneficial to that student to take a job in industry and get the lay of the land. It's funny, I did a lot of presentations at MIT, and I often got questions about how to start a company. But so it's interesting that the students start off as wanting to go to industry. Say 75% of the undergrads want to, at a freshman year, want to go into industry. And then in the senior year, 75% want to stay in academia. And so I asked them, why is this the case? And what I found is that engineers in particular didn't know what they were supposed to do in industry, and they were a little intimidated by it. Like, if I make this move, how am I going to be used? And so I said, you have to understand something from industry. When we hire you because you have aptitude, but we don't expect you to be able to do anything when you join industry. And we like to groom our engineers. So for example, many of them do SolidWorks design, and they take it to a molder, and the molder looks at them and says, how am I supposed to make this, right? But in industry, train them how to actually do good SolidWorks design, get them on with design products, and then learn and expose the engineers to sales and marketing and quality and clinical, and see what a whole company is about. And oftentimes I use an example of a recall that I had. And I said, what's the role of the engineer in this? Well, the manufacturing people saying, we got a recall, what am I going to do? Do we manufacture or not? Clinical people saying, I got a clinical trial, we have to stop it. And the regulatory people are saying, we're on pause. And everybody then looks at the engineers and said, it's up to you. You got to fix this problem, and you got to work with all of us, and you got to communicate. Let us know the progress. We're desperately waiting to hear how well you guys do. So engineering is a lot of fun in industry, because it's fun to get out a project and develop a successful product, just like you're all trying to do. But then you play a central role in a really key role in a medical device company. So engineering is critically important. How's that for a mouthful?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Kurt.
Yeah, but again, I think this program that you're having today is helpful for understanding what it takes to actually develop a medical company and found it.
Thank you,
More
Kurt.
questions?
Yeah, we have 2 more submitted online. I just want to encourage everyone else who's still here to just raise your hand and ask a question live if you want to. But for now, I'll keep on going with the submitted one online. So the next question here is, how did you go about determining the set of products the company would develop? How did you manage to present these different products to investors cohesively?
Yeah, I'm not sure I heard the question very well, but I think to paraphrase, you're saying, how did we decide on the products we were going to develop, and how did we convince the investors to be interested in them? Is that okay? So first of all, if you remember, when we started developing left ventricular assist devices, implantable devices, we identified there were several root causes for failure. And those included, in the original devices, that they had valves. By the way, the valves are flexing 40 million times a year, right? What's the projected durability of a valve? It's actually 80 million cycles. So the best we were ever going to do in the first device was 2 years of reliability. They also had flexing diaphragms. And those diaphragms are a piece of plastic that you can't touch, that are flexing 40 million times a year. How long will they flex until they break? And then the third failure mode was bearings. In that bent electric motor, we had a very complex sliding bearing. Basically, we had a follower bearing and a helical ramped cam, whereas the follower bearing was rotating 1 beat per heartbeat. It was sliding against the helical cam, and it was just designed to wear. Again, when you add those 3 failure modes, the best we were doing was 18 months, and we were having failures of valves and like before even that. So then we went to HeartMate 2 and got rid of those valves and bearings. And so now we're on a roll where we got a better device and much more durability and reliability going forward. And then it became obvious to me that we wanted to eliminate that final failure mode, which eliminate the mechanical bearings. So when you looked at Medtronic, I looked at the Medtronic device, the biopump. It had shafts, seals, bearings, and it was only reliable for 6 hours. And then we saw the durable devices, but I just did two things. I wanted to eliminate the failure modes, but I also wanted to see something in the market where it's really going to be applicable. So it turned out to be applicable for two places: HeartMate 3, which is a market-leading product right now, and the extracorporeal magnetically levitated system. So, and then I realized there's a huge industrial market for these pumps. So I could take the central mag motor and pump and go into the semiconductor field and do chemical mechanical planarization. I could do gold plating. I could do, all those various products, which, by the way, the industrial side still exists today, and it's doing extremely well, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue a year. So it was identifying a core platform that could be a workhorse for a lot of different products. And the investors saw the size of the markets, and it became immediately obvious there was tremendous potential for revenues. And so Abbott has the CentroMag now. They probably do 100 million in sales on it, and or 50 to 100 million, and they have 70% gross profit on it. Probably the most profitable product they have.
All right, so I think the bottom line is to learn from what you've done before and identify the needs and then improve and sell it accordingly.
Well, I'll tell you another reality, a question you didn't ask me, which is, those other two devices that Thoracic acquired, the UltraMag and the integrated pump oxygenator, why didn't they market them? And the answer is the UltraMag was developed to be 10% the cost of the current implantable devices. And the reason being was we didn't need the redundancy as an extracorporeal. But rest of world can't afford these expensive devices. So I developed that device for rest of world, and we had a line of folks that wanted to buy that device. What was the problem? It would sell for 10% the cost of the durable systems, right? And that would erode the pricing for everybody. So keep it off the market to maintain the high pricing. That's the answer why I got shelved. And we died when that happened because we really wanted to treat the rest of the world with more affordable technology. And that's what happens sometimes when you can't control the fate of where your products will end up.
That's very interesting.
They called it a poor man's bed. And that's what you guys should be developing. But if you develop it and you price it at a low price, you're going to really shake up the market.
Yeah, that has a very interesting learning. You would think, like, especially in medical technology, people are motivated by helping and improving the healthcare system, not mainly by revenue.
Well, I'm doing it again, and I'm going to price it very low.
We've got another question here about the budget. How to approach the budget? We want to raise money. How do we estimate how much based on the needs of the company?
A lot of times, you lay out your plan, and you can pretty much estimate what the cost of development will be. But you have a hard time estimating the cost of what regulatory is going to cost, quality is going to cost, et cetera. So you make a qualified guess. But in addition, you can go online and learn what the cost of development of various devices has been. And then you kind of adjust your budget because you want to probably come in close to what reality has been in the past. So you can look at a lot of different documents. One is called a 10Q for public companies, and you can see what their sales are and what the costs of development actually have been. And you can use that as a reality test to see if your budget's over or under what you anticipate. I also always use a chief financial officer They know all the other things that we don't know, like depreciation and cost of goods and SG&A and all these categories, and taxes and other stuff that they can add to it that you might not be able to estimate yourself.
All right, so basically doing your research and seeing what other people do, how much money other people need
Yeah.
to do similar things. Yeah, that's always a good way to look left and right and see what works and what doesn't, I guess. And
yeah, like I said, you can probably estimate what the materials are and the time and what it's going to cost to develop it. But there are all these other considerations that you might not be aware of that have to be factored into your budget. And it always takes longer than you think. And one of the when you're dealing with investors and shareholders, the mistake a lot of companies make is not adjusting their expectations. And I did everything in my power never to put a timeline in front of investors. They would always say, when's a clinical trial going to get done? And I'd say, with this technology and this platform, we're going to be doing clinical trials forever. So don't focus on that. Focus on the revenues. And because more often than not, even though you're doing your best effort, things happen that delay you. And that's why you want qualified investors that understand the medical field and the risks. More often than not, you're not going to be able to meet some milestone in time. But if you let them know along the way of what the delays might be, you'll be fine. But you cannot surprise investors with bad news. And if you got bad news, the first thing you should tell an investor is the bad news. Don't delay telling them. You lose your credibility.
But I guess that's a very important point as well, to be transparent with how you go.
Yeah, if you're leading a company, you have to do two things. You have to manage up, which means you have to manage the board, and you have to manage down. And you got to try to keep everybody happy but motivated. And as far as motivation in my companies, I focus on two things. What are two things that motivate people? One is achievement. So give them bite-sized pieces so they can achieve it. Don't give them a big project, just give them bite-sized pieces. And secondly, recognize them for the achievement they've made. And if you do those two things, it's not money, and it's not necessarily equity. It's achievement and recognition for accomplishing goals. And so when you're laying out managing people, again, give them bite-sized pieces they can achieve. If they don't achieve something, it's a losing proposition for everybody.
Yeah.
Which is what's so good about your Heart Hackathon. It's a great program and it sets goals, and you're all working hard to achieve those goals, and then whoever achieves it best is going to get recognized.
Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah, very well said. We've got a few more questions. I'm going to move on to the next one. Someone asked, how did you go about identifying your early adopters markets to show initial traction?
Yeah, again, fortunately, I was very familiar with the cardiopulmonary bypass market. By the way, when I brought the Swiss folks in, that's what they wanted this pump to be, a 6-hour bypass pump. But I saw that because we eliminated the failure modes, that it actually could be a much longer term pump than 6 hours. And so we saw it could go 30 days reliably. In fact, we had patients on a single device for a year in Germany. But once we knew that it had that reliability, and then we again saw that there were long-term pumps and 6-hour pumps, but there wasn't anything in the middle. And that's what we identified as a gap in the market, and therefore a market we should pursue. And it was not only cardiac, we did a lot of respiratory patients, a lot of ECMO. So like when H1N1 came, we saved over 1,000 patients with respiratory distress while we're operating as a VAD as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Sorry, I had some problems with my muting. Thanks, Kurt. There's another question from Jay. So if I'm going to read it out, if you want to add something, just feel free to unmute you. How a startup should strategize for a time period when the development is ongoing and the company is not earning anything through their products or services?
Yeah, so you're talking about the preclinical phase. I call it design phase 1, design phase 2. You're in a preclinical situation. You're not earning revenues. So from an investor's point of view, you're in no man's land. It's the hardest point to raise money. And believe it or not, the closer you get to clinical, say you now, you've been relying on high net worth angels to support the company, and you're begging them at that point to put more money in to support that product development to get to the point where you can do a feasibility trial, a clinical trial. The problem when you go to investors, if you go to venture capital, for example, at that time, they say, love the management team, love the product, love what you've accomplished. Come back to us when you have clinical data. That's why I call it no man's land. So the only thing you can do at that point is continue to raise money from private placements with individuals until you get to the point. Once you get to a clinical trial, then it opens up the door. Then strategic investors, venture capital, now they're interested, but it's very hard in the preclinical phase to raise money from anyone other than private investors. And so, the milestones you use to excite them in the preclinical phase is, at the point where you've had a pre-meeting with a regulatory body and they're in favor of the direction you're going. Design freeze is an inflection point value that you've now frozen the design. Another one is when you complete the most important verification studies, such as you completed reliability, you completed biocompatibility, molecular safety. We're getting really ready to submit to the regulatory body. So once you have that technical file submitted, that's an inflection point. And then you move to the clinical trial. So those are the milestones to attract the private investors to show that you're making the progress they want to see.
Thank you, Kurt. Are there more questions which want to be asked live? Anyone who wants to raise up their hands? All right, if not, I would suggest we just have a look at the final report template and especially at the commercialization plan there, because that's what the teams are going to have to submit in a couple of months. So there's one point, I'm not quite sure if you highlighted that too much. We were asking about a sustainability plan, and we're also referencing UN goals. Could you have that within your projects as well, like a sustainability plan?
You're talking about a usability plan, human factors? Oh, yeah.
Sure.
From, I'd say that 6 months into creating the company, we create a human factors plan. And that follows the usability requirements. That starts during the animal studies. And you have what's called a formative study, which is where all you're doing is documenting with surveys or engineering notebooks that you've raised questions about usability. So for example, if you have a display on a console Is the display intuitive? How easy is it to scroll through the menu? Do you understand the alarm schemes? And then move to batteries. If you had a choice between a battery that gives you 8 hours and a battery that only gives you 4 hours, which would you choose? Patients unanimously choose the smaller battery. They don't like the weight, and so on and so forth. But then you have to do what's called a summative study. And the summative study is where you actually bring all the users in different sessions. So the surgeons, followed by cardiologists, followed by the nurses in the operating room, nurses in the ICU, patients, patient caretakers, and you bring them into a room and you ask them, you've never seen this device, see if you can operate it. And invariably, they won't be able to. And you document why not. And then you train them and give them instructions for use and say, now try it. And they still make errors. And when you find those errors, you find that you've got to modify your design. There used to be a category in risk management called operator error. That doesn't exist anymore, because if an operator can make an error, you've got a design problem. Except, so for example, you've got a low battery alarm and the patient ignores it. And eventually the battery runs out of power and the patient ignores it. Whose fault is that? They were trained, but they didn't pay attention to it. So it gets complicated, but that's all part of human factors planning, and we always do that routinely.
All right, thank you. I've got another question. I thought it's really interesting how like the devices were not marketed because they were too cheap. So when you estimate the cost of the device you're developing, how do you consider that to make your project like expensive enough to not make it like thrown out or like not marketed, but still kind of affordable? Like, how do you deal with that kind of issue?
Just pricing, you do case studies on pricing and compare yourself against others and this, that, and the other, and then you establish your price. So there's one rule is, so for example, I'm working with a company that's developing a new ventricular assist device that's really outstanding. So when it goes to the market, one strategy that's often followed is make your product certainly equal, if not superior, in terms of pricing, because you don't want anyone to believe it's an inferior product. So that's one strategy. And that's unfortunate because it keeps the cost of devices high. And it's rarely a good idea to compete on pricing. It's really disruptive to the market. So, for example, on the Centromag, when I went out and priced it for my initial 10 centers, I priced it at $2,500. Thoracic priced it at $12,000. So, they have an extensive sales force and they were able to create a demand for it, and they got that very high pricing. I'm not as likely to price it so high because there's two ways of looking at it: a high price in low volume, or a lower price in high volume. So you really have to understand your market, but you want to price it at a premium either way, and not for the purpose of being greedy, but the purpose of appearances. So I'm going to tell you a little story. When I was chief scientist at Thermal Electron, we actually owned a company called Crusader Motors. It was outboard motors for boats, right? It was not doing well. It only had 1% of the market. And the company wanted to kill it. So they said, double the price on the spot, and nobody's going to buy it. It became the market leader. It was no different than what it was before. It took over the market because everybody believed it was a better device or better motor. It's a little crazy when it comes to pricing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting story. Interesting.
Oh, I
Someone
see what
asked,
reimbursement.
yeah, I was just about to say, someone asked about the
Yeah.
reimbursement strategy.
Yeah, that's obviously critical. And so the way reimbursement works in the United States, I think it's similar in other parts of the world, is in the United States, we have what's called the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid, CMS. And when we are approaching beginning of a clinical trial, we notify the reimbursement agency, which is part of the government, that we're coming. This is what the device is. Then you apply for regulatory approval, and the regulatory agency gives it a category. It's a category A if it's not reimbursable because there's not enough known about safety and effectiveness of the device or its type. Or you can get a category B which says it's reimbursable. That's nice. It's only a recommendation from the government regulatory body. That recommendation goes over to CMS that actually assigns codes and puts a reimbursement value on it. The way it works is after you start your clinical trial, you can go back to the government after you get your first ethics approval, or in our case, IRB approvals, to start the trial. And that then triggers CMS to make a decision of coverage. And then more often than not, in our field, in Heart Hackathon world, the device will be reimbursed. So that's how it works. Now there are, in pediatrics, it's not so clear because in the United States, it's not entirely covered by recommendations from the CMS. So in that case, when a hospital wants to do a pediatric patient on a bed, they often have to go to the third-party insurance folks that actually insure the patient. So it's a big effort to get those insurance companies to pay, but ultimately they do. But unfortunately, it's not a government blanket of reimbursement. You have to go one by one to the insurance agencies. And I have the reimbursement strategy for Europe and Australia. It's different than what I described, but in principle, it's the same.
Yeah, I guess there are like a lot of differences between the different continents. And on that note, as another question about which mark, like there are like different approval bodies for medical devices in different parts of the world. And I think if I recall correctly, it's like a different process as well to get your device approved in different parts of the world. And each is expensive, right? So how do I decide in which part of the world do I want to get my device approved first? And how do you go with this?
Well, in the old days, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States was very tough and a black box. And you could not just pick up the phone and talk to the Food and Drug Administration. It was very formal. So we went to Europe to get the CE mark. And I would go to Munich, for example, and meet with there's a notified body that communicates with the European Medicines Authority. And it was, quite honest, pretty easy to get a CE mark in the old days. Now, the MDR process for the European authorities is much harder than the United States. In Australia, your TGA is actually very reasonable, but there's harmonization happening around the world. And so Japan and Asia, Australia, Europe, and the United States are beginning to harmonize the regulatory paths. But the principles are the same across the board. They really all come in initially and look at your quality system. And that's your first review. The second review is technical, your technical dossier, which not only includes all your preclinical verification, validation, testing, and reports, but also your clinical trial and the outcome. And so in principle, they're the same, but the processes, for example, with the European Medicines Authority, MDR, are much more elaborate now than what we have in the United States. And then again, Australia is very reasonable. So today, what we tend to do is go to where the market is, but also where the regulatory path is more facilitative. So we go to the United States today, then we go to Australia. Australia is a great place. Canada is a very straightforward. South America and the rest of them, they accept pretty much the CE mark or FDA approvals. But Europe is probably the toughest place to get approved. Now, if you live in Europe, maybe it's a different story. And you work with experts in Europe, but that's how we do it. Look at the market, look at the simplest regulatory path.
Thank you. I think that's a good advice and very important for the report the teams are going to submit, because that's a section in there. I've received another question from Rashid. Jump in if you want to add something. I'm just going to read it out. How do you convince the inventor for long-term project investment?
How do you protect the inventor? Yes.
How do you convince the inventor? Because I think medical projects are like very long projects, like they take a long time to actually create revenue.
I'm going to make sure I understand. Did you say inventor or investor?
Investor.
Yeah, now I understand it. That's not easy. First of all, everyone presents a financial forecast, and everyone presents the most optimistic forecast they can. So the first way to lose your investor is to prevent some sort of hockey stick financials that everyone realizes are unachievable. So you have to present a credible forecast of your revenues and expenses that comes in the form of a profit and net loss P&L, if you will, that is presented to the investor. The more credible you make it, the more likely the investor is going to like it. And not everyone has an appetite for something that's going to take 5 years before they see a return. So it is critical to get the right investor that will accept that this is a longer term, higher risk investment. The bottom line, though, is in medical devices tend to be valuable companies. And although the risk is high, the reward is high too. And it's very common that a given investor, so for example, my main investor, George Asopoulos, put in $10 million. And he waited 5 years and he got $50 million. That's a pretty good deal. And medical companies tend to have high valuations and a high return, but the risks are high, and many times the risks are so high the company fails. So you got to have qualified investors that understand there's no guarantee. But I think I can excite you with comparable companies. That's something you often show investors. This is my company. This is what market I'm in. These are the comparable valuations of companies that have exited. If we're successful and we're anything like that, you can see what kind of return you're going to get.
Thank you. So I think the bottom line here is to find the right investors which are willing to go for the long run. and understand the process. There's another question in the chat. What other ways can you protect IP other than patents?
That's a really good question. So the first thing is everybody thinks publishing patents is a great idea. But in fact, what you've done is told the whole world what you're doing. Another part of intellectual property is trade secrets. So oftentimes when someone comes to me and they say, here's a really great patentable idea, I'll say, do you really want the world to see that? Because if they don't see it, it's a trade secret. And you're not telling anybody how you did this. And so trade secrets are critical. We kept a lot of things trade secret as opposed to making a patent out of it. But trade secrets fall under the umbrella of intellectual property. And when a company buys you, a strategic wants to buy you, that's when you unveil your trade secret. And they see how it's actually done and the value of it. But there's no question that they also want to see public, patents issued, which also create great value for the company. But trade secrets can too.
Thank you. I think that's a good learning to evaluate if you really want to tell the world what you're doing or whether keep it as your secret and therefore increase the value. So we are nearly at the end. Are there some more questions? You've got 5 more valuable minutes here. Anyone can ask, not only Hackathon participants. So if anyone else wants to jump in.
Well, I'll say that the questions that have been raised have been very good. And I wish I knew the answers before I ever started a company.
Yeah, I think your participation here is from immense value for everyone here with us. Maybe you can just get some closing words, Kurt. I think we've also sent you I don't know if you had a look at the report template, but in general, we're asking the teams to write up a business plan. Do you have any general advice for the teams how to go about this? Because I guess most of the participants are engineers, so might not have the financial or business background.
Yeah, obviously, you want to start with describing what the product is that you're trying to develop. You want to describe the market opportunity. That section on market opportunity is very important because at the end, you typically have a financial forecast, which is where you put together your projected revenues and the expenses and net profit. So you want to show that the market's big enough to support the financial forecast, which is going to be, that's what investors come in and look at. So if you're having a technical review, then it gets down to what's the competition, what's the product development plan, commercialization plan, what intellectual property you think you're going to have that, and why are you not infringing on something else that already exists. So IP area is really important for investors. And then manufacturing often is not thought about very much, but what's your plan for manufacturing? So for example, in my business plan, I made a prospective decision that I wanted to outsource as much as I could. So outsource the manufacturing, outsource some of the clinical to a clinical research organization. And basically the reason for that is to keep the fixed assets to a minimum. So when there are cycles in the market, when the market goes down and people have to let people go, I didn't have to do that because if you're having it manufactured outside, they deal with how they're going to deal with the number of people. So it didn't affect so that makes the company very attractive. I'm still part of the business plan. because in the absence of fixed assets, they're really purchasing a very lean, mean company. And they don't, and a lot of times strategics want to bring it in and manufacture it themselves. So why manufacture it yourself when you know they're going to do that, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, the business plan, if you ask me to make a credible business plan, I could probably give you a forecast of 3 months from now. They're going to ask you to do it for 5 or 10 years, and everybody knows it's just a complete guess. It's really hard to build a realistic plan. I mean, the most critical things for your hackathon probably will be, what is the product? What's the potential for IP? What's the product development plan? And, you know, in the forecast, what the development costs. But I don't think anybody's really going to look to see your revenue forecast. I mean, that's really hard for a seasoned pro to do.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that these are nice words to close it up here. So to all the teens, remember what Kurt said. Do your plan, stay realistic, and
just
be aware.
enjoy yourselves. It's really a great exercise that you're going through. And boy, it would be great. You know, if I could see a show of hands, how many people would actually, if the stars lined up and the funding were available and the opportunity was available, how many of you would want to start a company in your future at the right time? So, I see Jaden does. We're growing. Fantastic. Hey, listen, I'm always available. Anybody, any of you that ever want to directly contact me or talk about it, I'm really more than happy to help you, because I was in your shoes and I know what it's like. But I would hope that I could be helpful to you. So that's wonderful to see. Congratulations to those that really want to do this.
That's wonderful. All right. So
Yeah.
I think I'll close it off here. These are like great words from you, Kurt. Thank you so much for supporting us, the whole
Thank you,
competition.
everybody. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.